I remember the exact moment my world cracked open. It was 3 in the morning, and I was sitting in my patrol car outside a 24-hour pharmacy on Hollister Avenue, watching the fog roll in from the coast. My partner Denise had gone inside to grab us coffee, and I was scrolling through my phone, looking at a photo Simone had sent me earlier that night. She was in our bed, wearing that old university t-shirt of mine, smiling at the camera with sleepy eyes. The caption said, "Missing you. Stay safe out there." I must have looked at that picture 15 times during my shift. I remember thinking about how lucky I was, how some guys on the force came home to empty apartments and cold dinners, but I had Simone. Beautiful, patient, understanding Simone, who never complained about my schedule, who always had something warm waiting for me when I stumbled through the door at dawn. That was 3 months before I discovered she had been living an entirely separate life for almost 2 years. 3 months before I learned that the woman I had planned to marry was not just unfaithful, but was running something far more calculated, far more destructive than a simple affair. And 3 months before I realized that every skill I had developed as a police officer would become the tool I used to dismantle her carefully constructed world. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand how I ended up where I am now, sitting in my new apartment with a sense of peace I never thought I would feel again, I need to take you back to the beginning. Not to the betrayal itself, but to the years before it, to the foundation she spent so long pretending to build with me. I met Simone Whitfield at a community outreach event in Santa Barbara. I was 2 years into my career as a patrol officer, working the graveyard shift, because that is where they put the newer guys, and I had volunteered to help run a safety workshop at a local youth center on one of my rare days off. She was there as a representative from a nonprofit that worked with at-risk teenagers. The moment I saw her, I felt something shift inside my chest. She had this warmth about her, this way of looking at people like they were the only person in the room. When she laughed, it was full and genuine. And when she spoke about her work, her eyes lit up with passion. We talked for 3 hours after the event ended. She told me about growing up in Oakland, about losing her mother young, about how she had fought her way through college on scholarships and determination. I told her about my own upbringing in Bakersfield, about my father who had been a sheriff's deputy before he passed, about how I had always known I wanted to follow in his footsteps. By the end of that conversation, I knew I wanted to see her again, and again, and again. We dated for 8 months before she moved into my apartment. We were together for 3 years before I proposed on a cliff overlooking the Pacific, with the sunset painting the sky orange and pink behind us. She cried. She said yes. She held my face in her hands and told me I was the best thing that had ever happened to her. I believed every word. For the next 2 years, we planned our future together. We talked about buying a house, about having children, about growing old on a porch somewhere watching our grandchildren play in the yard. She was supportive of my career in a way I had never experienced. Most partners of police officers struggle with the hours, the danger, the stress we bring home. But Simone seemed to understand. She never complained when I worked holidays. She never made me feel guilty for missing dinners or coming home exhausted. She would kiss me goodbye before my night shifts, tell me to be safe, and be sound asleep by the time I returned in the morning. At least, that is what I thought she was doing. The first crack appeared on an ordinary Tuesday. I was supposed to work my regular shift, 10 at night until 6 in the morning, but one of the senior officers had a family emergency, and I agreed to swap schedules with him. Instead of heading to the station that evening, I would work a day shift the following afternoon. I sent Simone a text around 5 to let her know, but she did not respond. That was not unusual. She often had late meetings for her nonprofit work, and sometimes did not check her phone for hours. I stopped at the grocery store on my way home, picked up ingredients for dinner, thinking I would surprise her by cooking for once. When I pulled into our apartment complex around 7, I noticed something strange. Simone's car was not in its usual spot. That was odd, because she had told me that morning that she would be working from home all day. I assumed she had run an errand and thought nothing more of it. I let myself in, set the groceries on the counter, and started putting things away. That is when I noticed the apartment felt different. Not messy exactly, but disturbed in small ways. A pillow on the couch was out of place. There was a water glass on the coffee table that had not been there when I left. The bathroom smelled faintly of cologne, something musky and foreign that I did not recognize. I stood in the hallway for a long moment, trying to rationalize what I was sensing. Maybe she had a friend over. Maybe she had tried a new air freshener. Maybe I was imagining things because I was tired and my mind was playing tricks on me. Simone came home an hour later, breezing through the door with shopping bags in her hands and a smile on her face. She acted surprised to see me, delighted even, and launched into a story about how her meeting had been canceled, so she had decided to do some retail therapy at the mall. She kissed me. She asked about my day. She helped me finish cooking dinner, and we ate together at our small kitchen table while she told me about a new project her nonprofit was starting. I watched her across that table, this woman I had loved for 5 years, and I felt something cold settle in my stomach. She was lying. I could not prove it yet, but I knew. Call it intuition, call it professional instinct, but I had spent enough time interviewing suspects and witnesses to recognize when someone was performing a version of themselves. I did not confront her that night. I did not say anything at all. Instead, I started paying attention in a way I never had before. Over the next few weeks, I kept a mental log of inconsistencies. Her phone, which had always been carelessly left on the coffee table or the kitchen counter, was now always face down or in her pocket. She started taking calls in another room, stepping out onto the balcony with the door closed, claiming it was work-related. Her schedule, which had always been predictable, became fluid and vague. She would mention lunch with friends I had never heard of, meetings that ran late, errands that took hours. I started checking the mileage on her car. I knew it was invasive, knew it crossed a line that I would have judged another man for crossing, but I could not shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted in our relationship. Over the course of a single week, she put 200 miles on her car for what she claimed were trips to the mall and the grocery store, both of which were less than 10 minutes from our apartment. One night, while she was in the shower, her phone buzzed on the nightstand. I should not have looked. I knew even as I reached for it that I was violating her privacy, violating the trust that was supposed to be the foundation of our relationship. But something in me had already broken. Some faith had already been shattered, and I needed to know. The message was from someone named Denise, work, and it read, "Tonight was incredible. Can't wait to see you again. Same time Thursday?" I stared at those words until they burned themselves into my memory. Then I placed the phone exactly where I had found it and lay back down in bed. When Simone emerged from the bathroom, toweling off her hair, I pretended to be asleep. She slid into bed beside me, pressed a kiss to my shoulder, and whispered, "I love you." I felt nothing. Absolutely nothing. The next morning, I began a systematic investigation into my fiancé's secret life. I want to be clear that I did everything legally. I did not access her personal accounts or hack into her devices. I did not use police resources inappropriately or abuse my position. What I did was use the observational and analytical skills I had developed over years on the force to piece together a picture of who Simone really was. I started keeping a detailed journal. Dates, times, discrepancies between what she said and what was actually true. I noted every time she claimed to be one place, but her car said she had driven significantly farther. I cataloged every mysterious phone call, every new excuse, every time she gasped slightly when I came home at an unexpected hour. It was another month before I learned the identity of Denise Work. I was off duty, sitting in a coffee shop across the street from Simone's nonprofit office. Something I am not particularly proud of, but felt I needed to do. I watched her leave around noon, expecting her to head to the lunch spot she always mentioned. Instead, she got in her car and drove to a residential neighborhood about 15 miles away. I followed at a distance, my heart hammering in my chest. Part of me still hoped there was an innocent explanation, Maybe she was visiting a sick friend. Maybe she was doing outreach for work. Maybe I was a paranoid fool who was about to destroy his relationship over nothing. She pulled into the driveway of a large house in an upscale neighborhood. I parked down the street and watched through my rearview mirror as she walked to the front door. Before she could knock, it opened, and a man stepped out to greet her. He was tall, white, with graying hair, and the kind of confident posture that comes with money and power. He pulled her into his arms and kissed her in a way that told me everything I needed to know. This was not a first kiss. This was not a new relationship. This was something that had been going on for a long time. I sat in my car for 20 minutes, watching that closed front door, feeling the last remnants of my denial crumble away. Then I drove home, walked into our apartment, sat down on the couch, and tried to figure out what to do next. Here is the thing about being a police officer that civilians do not always understand. We are trained to respond to crisis with calm, to gather information before taking action, to build cases methodically rather than react emotionally. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to call her, confront her, demand answers. But the analytical part of my brain knew that doing so would only give her time to cover her tracks, craft excuses, minimize what she had done. I needed to know the full scope of what I was dealing with before I made any moves. Over the following weeks, I transformed our apartment into a quiet evidence collection operation. I did not plant cameras or recording devices because that would have been illegal. I simply paid attention to everything and documented what I found through legitimate means. I started checking our shared accounts more frequently and noticed patterns I had missed before. Cash withdrawals that did not match any purchases I could account for. Credit card charges at restaurants and stores I knew she had never mentioned visiting. I researched the man I had seen. His name was William Cross, and he was the chief financial officer of a tech company based in Los Angeles. He was 53 years old, divorced, and according to public records, worth several $1 million. He owned the house where I had seen Simone enter, as well as a vacation property in Lake Tahoe and an apartment in San Francisco. That discovery sent me down a new path of investigation. If Simone was having an affair with a wealthy executive, what exactly was she getting from him? And more importantly, what was she telling him about us? The answer came 3 weeks later, quite by accident. I was working a night shift when we received a call about a suspicious vehicle parked near a closed business park. My partner and I responded, found nothing concerning, and were heading back to patrol when I noticed a familiar car in the parking lot of a nearby hotel. It was William Cross's car, a distinctive silver Mercedes with a personalized license plate I had made note of during my earlier research. I told my partner I needed to use the restroom and went inside the hotel lobby. I did not enter with any plan in mind. I was simply following an instinct, that same gut feeling that had first told me something was wrong in my apartment months earlier. The lobby was quiet, just a bored desk clerk scrolling through their phone and a few business travelers checking in late. I walked past the front desk, acting like I knew exactly where I was going, and made my way toward the elevator bank. That is when I heard her voice. Simone was standing at the bar adjacent to the lobby, her back to me, talking to William Cross. They were seated close together, and she was laughing at something he had said. Even from across the room, I could see her hand resting on his thigh, but it was what she said next that stopped me cold. "Don't worry about him," she said, her voice carrying just enough for me to hear. "He's working tonight. He's always working. That's why this is so easy. He has no idea, and by the time we're ready to make things official, I'll have everything in place." William said something I could not hear, and Simone laughed again. "Trust me," she continued. "I've been doing this for almost 2 years. He's completely clueless. The poor man thinks we're getting married next spring. By then, I'll have access to everything I need, and you and I can finally stop sneaking around." I stood in that hallway, invisible in my uniform, listening to the woman I loved discuss me like I was a mark in a con game. I felt something shift inside me in that moment, something that went beyond hurt or anger. It was clarity. Cold, crystalline clarity about exactly who Simone Whitfield was and what she had been doing. I left the hotel without being seen. I finished my shift on autopilot, responding to calls, writing reports, going through the motions while my mind raced through everything I had just learned. She was not simply having an affair. She was running some kind of long-term scheme, using me as cover while she positioned herself for something bigger. But what? What did she mean by access to everything I need? The answer took me another 2 weeks to uncover, and when I found it, the betrayal cut even deeper than I had imagined possible. I had been so focused on Simone's deception that I had not thought to look closely at her nonprofit organization. It was called Rising Futures, and it provided mentorship and educational support to at-risk youth. I had attended their fundraisers, donated to their annual campaigns, proudly told people that my fiancée dedicated her life to helping kids in need. But when I started digging into public records, tax filings, and financial disclosures, a disturbing picture emerged. Rising Futures received substantial donations, including several large gifts from individuals and corporations. But the organization's actual program spending was surprisingly low. Most of their budget seemed to go toward administrative costs and consultant fees. I spent 3 nights at my kitchen table after Simone had gone to bed, poring over documents I had obtained through public records requests. What I found made me sick to my stomach. Rising Futures was paying a company called Whitfield Consulting nearly $200,000 a year for strategic advisory services. Whitfield Consulting had been registered in Nevada 3 years earlier. Its listed owner was Simone Whitfield. My fiancée was funneling money from a children's charity into her own pocket. I sat back in my chair, staring at the documents spread across the table, and felt the world tilt beneath me. This was not just an affair. This was not just lying to the man who loved her. This was fraud. This was theft from vulnerable children. This was a calculated criminal enterprise hidden behind a mask of compassion and good works. And then I realized something else. William Cross. He was the CFO of a tech company that had donated heavily to Rising Futures. Had he discovered what she was doing? Was that why she was involved with him? Was she paying him off, sleeping with him to keep him quiet, or were they in this together? The more I dug, the more complicated the picture became. But one thing was absolutely clear. Simone had been using me from the very beginning. My position as a police officer gave her credibility, made her seem trustworthy and connected. When she attended law enforcement charity events on my arm, when she was photographed with police leadership at community functions, she was building a cover story that made her nonprofit seem beyond reproach. I was not her fiancé. I was her shield. The realization did not break me the way I might have expected. Instead, it galvanized me. For the first time since this nightmare began, I knew exactly what I was dealing with and exactly what I needed to do about it. Simone had made a critical error in choosing a police officer as her unwitting accomplice. She had assumed that my long hours and exhausting schedule would keep me blind to her activities. She had not counted on those same skills being turned toward her. I began building a case. I want to be absolutely clear about something. At no point did I use my position as a police officer to access records I was not entitled to see or to investigate Simone in my official capacity. What I did was conduct research that any private citizen could have done with public records and legal resources. The difference was that I knew how to do it efficiently, how to connect dots that others might miss, and how to document everything in a way that would hold up to scrutiny. I also knew something else. If Simone was defrauding a nonprofit, the appropriate authority to investigate was not the local police department where I worked. It was the state attorney general's office, which had jurisdiction over charitable organizations. I spent a weekend drafting a detailed complaint, attaching every document I had gathered, and submitted it anonymously through their online reporting system. Then I waited. The hardest part of those next few months was pretending that nothing had changed. Every morning, I woke up next to a woman I now viewed as a criminal. Every evening, I came home to find her preparing dinner, asking about my day, acting out the role of loving fiancé. I participated in that performance because I knew that any sign of suspicion would give her time to cover her tracks or flee. I became a method actor in my own life. I smiled when she smiled. I kissed her goodbye before my shifts. I discussed wedding venues and honeymoon destinations as if I still believed any of it would happen. And all the while, I was watching, documenting, waiting. The break in the case came from an unexpected direction. One night, about 4 months after I had submitted my complaint to the Attorney General's office, I was working patrol when we received a call about a possible domestic disturbance at a residence in a wealthy neighborhood. My partner and I responded, and when we arrived, I felt my blood run cold. It was William Cross's house. A woman was standing in the driveway, screaming at the closed front door. She appeared to be in her late 40s, well-dressed despite the late hour, and absolutely furious. When we approached, she turned to us with mascara-streaked cheeks and said, "I want that woman arrested. She's been having an affair with my husband for 2 years, and I have proof." I should have recused myself from the situation. I knew that. The moment I realized what was happening, I should have told my partner that I had a personal connection to the case and stepped back. But something stopped me. Call it fate, call it karma, call it the universe finally giving me an opportunity I could not pass up. I stayed. The woman's name was Caroline Cross, and she was William's ex-wife. Except, as I learned over the next few minutes, they were not actually divorced. The divorce had been filed but never finalized because William had been hiding assets, and Caroline's lawyers had kept finding new accounts to dispute. And here was where things got interesting. Caroline had hired a private investigator after becoming suspicious of William's behavior. That investigator had spent 6 months documenting William's relationship with Simone, including hotel stays, gifts, and most importantly, financial transactions. Caroline had discovered that William had been funneling money to Simone through various channels, including donations to her nonprofit and direct payments to her consulting company. But that was not the most damaging thing the investigator had found. "He's been helping her steal from that children's charity," Caroline said, her voice shaking with anger. "I have bank records, emails, everything. They've been running this scheme together, and he's been using our marital assets to fund it. That's why he's been hiding money from the divorce proceedings. Because if it comes out where that money really went, they both go to prison." I stood in that driveway, listening to William Cross's wife lay out a case that perfectly complemented everything I had discovered on my own, and I felt something I had not felt in months: hope. I could not do anything with this information in my capacity as a responding officer, but I could make sure it reached the right people. I took Caroline's statement professionally and thoroughly. I documented everything she told me, and at the end of the encounter, when she asked if there was anything else she could do, I mentioned that the State Attorney General's office had a charitable trust division that investigated nonprofit fraud. I suggested she might want to share her private investigator's findings with them. She looked at me with something like gratitude in her eyes and promised she would. 2 weeks later, the investigation became official. I learned about it the same way everyone else did, through a news story about the Attorney General's office opening an inquiry into financial irregularities at Rising Futures. Simone came home that night in a state of barely concealed panic, though she tried to hide it behind a mask of indignation. "Can you believe this?" she said, waving her phone at me. "Someone reported us to the state. They're saying we mismanaged funds. It's absolutely ridiculous. We're a small nonprofit. We don't have the resources for some big fancy accounting department. If there are irregularities, they're just bookkeeping errors." I nodded sympathetically. I made all the right noises about how unfair it was, how surely the investigation would clear everything up, how she had nothing to worry about if she had done nothing wrong. Inside, I was counting down the days. The investigation moved slowly, as these things do, but I tracked its progress through public records and news reports. Subpoenas were issued, bank records were examined, former employees were interviewed, and gradually, the truth began to emerge. The Attorney General's office discovered that Rising Futures had diverted more than $800,000 over 4 years to Whitfield Consulting, which had provided no actual services to the nonprofit. They discovered that Simone had used charity funds to pay for personal expenses, including trips to Lake Tahoe and San Francisco that she had claimed were for donor cultivation. They discovered that William Cross had facilitated several of these transactions through his company's donations, receiving kickbacks in the form of consulting fees to a company he secretly controlled. But the revelation that made headlines, the one that turned a financial fraud case into a scandal that captured the attention of every news outlet in the state, was something even I had not discovered. Rising Futures had been claiming to serve hundreds of at-risk youth through its mentorship programs. It had collected donations, applied for grants, and produced annual reports showing impressive outcomes. But when investigators actually tried to verify those claims, they found that most of it was fabricated. The mentorship sessions had never happened. The youth who were supposedly being helped either did not exist or had never been contacted by the organization. The entire nonprofit was essentially a front for funneling money to Simone and her accomplices. She had stolen from imaginary children. When the indictments came down, I was at work. One of the detectives in our department, a woman named Rodriguez, who I had always respected, came to find me in the break room. She looked uncomfortable, which was unusual for her. "Thompson," she said, "I need to give you a heads up about something. It's going to be in the news within the hour, and I thought you should hear it from a colleague first." I knew what she was going to say before she said it, but I let her tell me anyway, playing the role of shocked and devastated fiancé one last time. Simone Whitfield had been arrested at our apartment that morning on charges of wire fraud, money laundering, and theft from a charitable organization. William Cross had been arrested at his home on related charges. A third person, an accountant who had helped cook the books, had also been taken into custody. I thanked Rodriguez for telling me. I asked for the rest of the day off, and then I drove home to an empty apartment, sat down on our couch, and finally let myself feel everything I had been suppressing for the past 9 months. I did not cry. I had thought I might, but there were no tears left. What I felt instead was a strange kind of emptiness, followed gradually by something that took me a long time to identify. It was relief. The performance was over. I did not have to pretend anymore. The months between Simone's arrest and her trial were complicated. She was released on bail, but she was not allowed to return to our shared apartment because I had obtained a restraining order. Her lawyer tried to contact me several times, I assumed to find out what I knew and whether I would be testifying against her. I referred all inquiries to the prosecutor's office. She sent me a letter from her mother's house, where she was staying while awaiting trial. It was 8 pages long, a masterpiece of manipulation and self-justification. She claimed she had been pressured into the scheme by William Cross, who had threatened to expose their affair if she did not cooperate. She claimed she had always intended to pay the money back. She claimed she still loved me and that everything about our relationship had been real, even if other things in her life had not been. I read that letter once, then I burned it. The trial was a media circus. Rising Futures had received donations from several prominent local businesses and community organizations, and those donors were furious. Families who had supported the nonprofit thinking they were helping at-risk kids now realized they had been conned. The courtroom was packed every day with journalists, former donors, and curious members of the public. I attended one day of the trial, the day when the prosecution presented evidence about Simone's personal finances. I sat in the back of the courtroom, in civilian clothes, and watched as an investigator walked through spreadsheets showing how money had moved from the charity to Simone's consulting company to her personal accounts. I watched as exhibits were shown proving that she had used those funds for vacations, jewelry, designer clothes, and payments on a sports car she had told me was a lease through her employer. At one point, Simone looked up from the defense table and our eyes met. I do not know what she expected to see in my face. Anger, perhaps. Hurt. Maybe she thought I still loved her somewhere beneath everything and would feel sympathy for her predicament. What she saw instead was nothing at all. I had turned off whatever part of me had once cared for her. I looked at her the same way I looked at every other criminal I had encountered in my career, with professional detachment and quiet contempt. She looked away first. The jury deliberated for 3 days before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Simone was convicted of wire fraud, money laundering, theft from a charitable organization, and making false statements. William Cross was convicted on related charges, and the accountant pleaded guilty in exchange for a reduced sentence. At sentencing, the judge was not merciful. She spoke about the particular harm caused by people who exploit charitable giving, who prey on the generosity of donors who want to help vulnerable populations. She talked about the real children who could have been helped if the money donated to Rising Futures had actually been used for its stated purpose. She said that crimes like this do not just steal money, they steal trust, and they make people reluctant to give to legitimate charities that are doing genuine good in the world. Simone was sentenced to 7 years in federal prison. William Cross received 9 years because of his role in facilitating the scheme and the larger amounts of money he had diverted. The accountant received 3 years. I was not in the courtroom for the sentencing. I had already moved on with my life. But I watched the news coverage that night, saw Simone being led out of the courthouse in handcuffs, and felt something I had not expected to feel. It was not satisfaction exactly. It was not joy or triumph. It was more like a door closing. The final chapter of that part of my life ending, making room for whatever came next. In the aftermath of everything, I took some time to put my life back together. I sold most of the furniture from our apartment because I could not look at it without seeing her. I transferred to a different precinct, not because I had done anything wrong, but because I needed a fresh start. I started seeing a therapist, something I had always thought was not necessary for someone like me, and discovered that talking through what I had experienced helped me process it in ways I could not have managed on my own. The therapist asked me once if I regretted how I had handled the situation. She wanted to know if I wished I had confronted Simone directly instead of building a case against her. If I felt guilty about essentially conducting a private investigation into my own fiancée. I thought about the question for a long time before answering. No, I finally said. I don't regret it. If I had confronted her when I first suspected something, she would have lied her way out of it. She would have made me feel like the crazy one, the paranoid boyfriend who couldn't trust his partner. And if I had somehow gotten through to her, if she had confessed, then what? She would have begged forgiveness, promised to change, and I would have been faced with the choice of turning in the woman I loved or becoming complicit in her crimes. This way, justice happened. The people who were stolen from got some measure of closure, and I got the truth. The therapist nodded and wrote something in her notebook. I never asked what it was. There is one more piece of this story that I need to tell. One more twist that came nearly a year after Simone's conviction, when I thought I had already learned everything there was to know about her deception. I received a call from an investigator at the Attorney General's office. She wanted to meet with me in person to discuss something related to the case. I agreed, curious about what could possibly be left to uncover. We met at a coffee shop near my new precinct. She was a sharp-looking woman in her 50s, with gray-streaked hair and the kind of direct gaze that suggested she had seen every kind of human depravity in her career. "Mr. Thompson," she said after we had gotten our drinks and settled into a corner booth, "I wanted to thank you personally for your help in this case. The complaint you filed was what started the whole investigation. Without it, Simone Whitfield and her accomplices might still be operating today." I nodded, accepting her thanks. "I'm glad justice was served. There's something else," she continued. "Something we discovered during the investigation that we weren't able to use at trial because it wasn't directly related to the charges. But I thought you should know, given your personal connection to the defendant." She slid a folder across the table. I opened it to find a collection of documents, including printouts of emails and what appeared to be a private investigator's report. "Before you," she said. There was someone else. A man named David Chen. He was a prosecutor in Sacramento. Simone dated him for 2 years, got engaged to him, and was living with him when she first started working at Rising Futures. When that relationship ended, she moved to Santa Barbara and met you. I looked up from the documents. What happened to him? He died, she said simply. About 6 months before you and Simone met. Heart attack, supposedly. He was 42 years old, no prior history of heart problems. The death was not investigated at the time because there was no reason to suspect foul play. I felt a chill run down my spine. Are you saying? I'm not saying anything definitively. We don't have evidence, but we found emails between Simone and a contact in Mexico discussing something called natural methods. We found receipts for purchases of certain substances that, in large quantities, can cause cardiac events that look like natural heart attacks. And we found out that David Chen had a life insurance policy naming Simone as the beneficiary. She collected $200,000 after his death. I sat in that coffee shop, holding documents that suggested the woman I had almost married might be a murderer, and I felt the world shift beneath me again. It was a feeling I was becoming familiar with, the sensation of discovering that reality was far darker than I had imagined. Why are you telling me this? I asked. Because we can't prosecute without more evidence, and we're unlikely to get it. David Chen was cremated, so there's no body to examine. The emails are circumstantial at best. But I thought you deserved to know who you were really dealing with. And I thought... She paused, choosing her words carefully. I thought you might want to know that when you figured out what she was doing and turned her in, you might have saved more than just charity money. You might have saved your own life. I drove home that night in a daze. I sat in my new apartment, in furniture I had picked out myself, and I thought about everything that might have happened if I had not followed my instincts. If I had not paid attention to the inconsistencies. If I had married her, combined our finances, become even more useful to her schemes. Would I have ended up like David Chen? Would she have found some natural method to eliminate me once I was no longer necessary? Would my death have been written off as a tragic accident, leaving her free to collect insurance money and find her next victim? I will never know for certain. But I know this. Trusting my instincts as an officer, using the skills I had developed over years of police work, had protected me from a predator I had invited into my life. The same attention to detail that made me good at my job had saved me from a fate I could not have imagined when I first looked across that community center at a beautiful woman with a warm smile. It has been 3 years since Simone went to prison. I have heard through various channels that she has tried to file appeals, all of which have been denied. She will be eligible for parole in another 2 years. Though given her lack of remorse during the trial, I doubt she will be released early. William Cross is still serving his sentence. The accountant was released last year and has reportedly moved to another state. I have built a new life. I was promoted to detective last year, working in the financial crimes unit. It seems fitting somehow, using my experience to help others who have been victimized by people they trusted. I am dating someone new, a nurse named Alicia, who knows everything about my past and who I am slowly learning to trust. The therapist says I am making good progress, though she also says that healing is not linear and I should expect setbacks. I think about Simone sometimes, not with love or even with hate, but with a kind of distant curiosity. I wonder if she ever truly cared for me, or if I was always just a means to an end. I wonder if she thinks about me, sitting in her cell, and feels regret for what she did. I wonder if she understands that the same qualities that made me useful to her, my stability, my dedication, my attention to detail, were ultimately what brought her down. I think about David Chen, too, a man I never met, who died before I entered Simone's orbit, who might have been her first victim. I think about the life he could have had, the family he could have built, the career he could have continued. I think about how close I came to joining him in whatever place souls go when they are cut short by human evil. And I think about the moment in that hotel lobby, when I heard Simone laughing with William Cross, dismissing me as a fool who would never figure out what she was doing. I think about how wrong she was, how fundamentally she had misjudged the man she had chosen as her shield, how she had mistaken my trust for stupidity, my long hours for inattention, my love for blindness. She thought I would never close the case because I would never know there was a case to close. But I was the officer who did close it. Not officially, not in my capacity as a member of the department, but in every way that mattered. I gathered the evidence, I put it in front of the people who could act on it. I waited patiently while the wheels of justice turned, and when those wheels finally crushed her carefully constructed world, I was watching from a seat I had earned through my own persistence and skill. That is the thing about betrayal. The people who practice it think they understand their victims better than those victims understand themselves. They think they can predict our behavior, manipulate our emotions, stay one step ahead of our suspicions. But they forget that we are not static creatures. We grow, we learn, we develop instincts about danger that we did not have before. Simone thought she knew me. She thought 5 years together had given her a complete map of my mind, every weakness and blind spot carefully charted for exploitation. But she did not know the person I became when I started paying attention. She did not know the investigator I transformed into when I realized I was being played. She did not know that every skill I had developed to protect my community could be turned toward protecting myself. She knows now. Some nights, when I am lying in bed listening to the quiet sounds of my new neighborhood, I think about what my father would say if he could see how this all turned out. He was a sheriff's deputy for 30 years, a man who believed in justice and procedure and doing things the right way even when the wrong way was easier. He died when I was 25, too soon to see me graduate from the academy, too soon to meet the women I would love and lose. I think he would be proud of how I handled Simone. Not because I destroyed her, but because I did it correctly. I did not break the law to enforce it. I did not abuse my position to pursue a personal vendetta. I simply paid attention, documented what I found, and trusted the system to do its job. That was what he always taught me. That was what made him the kind of officer that people in his community still remember with respect and affection. Justice is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is just patient documentation and anonymous complaints and a willingness to let the truth speak for itself. Sometimes revenge is not an explosive confrontation, but a quiet removal of yourself from someone's power, followed by the careful assembly of evidence that ensures they can never hurt anyone again. I removed the ring I had bought for Simone from the drawer where I had been keeping it and sold it to a jeweler downtown. The money went to a charity that actually helps at-risk youth, one I verified thoroughly before making the donation. It felt like closing a circle somehow, taking something that had been meant to symbolize our future together and transforming it into genuine good for children who had been victims of people like her. She cheated while I worked night shifts. She built a criminal empire behind my back, using my career as cover for her schemes, using my trust as a weapon against me. She thought the hours I spent protecting my community were hours she could spend betraying it. But I was the officer who closed the case on her. Not because I was assigned to it, but because I saw what needed to be done, and I did it. Because I refused to be a victim even when I discovered I had been victimized. Because I took everything she thought she knew about me and proved her wrong. That is my story. That is how I survived the worst betrayal of my life and came out the other side stronger, wiser, and more committed than ever to the work I was born to do. I do not know what the future holds, but I know that I will face it with my eyes open, my instincts sharp, and my faith in justice intact. She tried to break me. She failed. And now she has years in a federal prison to think about exactly how and why she underestimated the man she thought she had fooled.